You never forget the first time you saw them. For us, it was outside a smashed-up village in Ukraine, the mud so deep it could pull the boots right off your feet. We were Lancer, just plain old soldiers, caked in that grey-brown muck from head to toe, our uniforms more earth than cloth, smelling of sweat, damp wool and cordite. We'd been in the line for weeks, living like rats in the dirt, and then they arrived. The SS. Their trucks were clean, a ridiculous notion out there, and they stepped out like they were on parade ground in Berlin. Their black Panzer uniforms were pristine, their faces clean-shaven, their equipment all new, not the worn-out junk we'd been issued. They moved with this arrogant swagger, and the way they looked at us, it wasn't with camaraderie, not even with pity. It was like looking through a pane of glass. We were part of the landscape, another piece of the ruin, something to be stepped over. I remember the cold feeling that settled in my stomach, a knot of ice that never really went away. It was the realization that these men, who wore the same national emblem on their helmets, were not bound by the same code we were. We were soldiers. We fought other soldiers. But you looked into their eyes, and you saw something else entirely, a coldness that had nothing to do with the war or the winter. That was the first day, and it only got worse from there. Life in the trenches with them was a careful, silent dance. They kept to their own dugouts, which were always deeper and better reinforced than ours, and we kept to ours. The mess line, that great equalizer for the rest of us, became a place of quiet tension. You'd be there, holding your mess tin, smelling the thin stew, dreaming of a taste of something from home, and they'd march in. They never queued, not really. There was an unspoken understanding that they went first. And you'd see what they got: thicker slices of bread, sometimes even real butter, cuts of meat in their stew while we got gristle. You pretended not to notice, you stared at your own tin, but the resentment boiled inside you, a low heat under the constant chill of fear. We'd whisper about them back in our foxhole, my buddy Klaus and me. He was from Hamburg, a dock worker before the war, with a dark sense of humor that kept us sane. He'd say, "Hey, Hans, you see the new toy? Those MP40s aren't even rusty. Must be nice to have a friend in high places." But it was nervous laughter. The stories were the worst. Not stories from the front, but from the rear. Whispers about what they did to partisans, to civilians, and worse, to any regular army soldier who dared to question them. There was a tale about a Wehrmacht lieutenant who protested the execution of some villagers. He was found later with a note pinned to his chest accusing him of cowardice in the face of the enemy. After that, you learned to keep your head down and your mouth shut. The enemy was in front of us, but a different kind of danger was sharing our trench. The worst part was the aftermath of their actions. You'd feel a collective dread settle over the whole company when the word came down that an SS unit was being attached to our sector for an operation. It wasn't just because it meant a big push was coming. It was because we knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the ground beneath us, that whatever village or town we took, there would be a retaliation so fierce it would make the fighting beforehand seem tame. They'd go in, and then the reprisals would start. I remember once, after a particularly brutal fight where we'd finally pushed the Reds out of a small town, the SS moved in to mop up. We were exhausted, just glad to be alive, setting up a perimeter, trying to find a dry spot to sleep. Then the smell came. Not the usual smell of death that was familiar, a sickly sweet odor you never got used to, but the smell of smoke, of burning wood and something else, something worse. We looked back and the whole eastern part of the town was ablaze. It wasn't artillery fire, it was systematic. And the sounds, not gunfire, but single, sporadic shots. And then, later, silence. A heavy, awful silence. We didn't talk about it. We just looked at each other, and in every man's eyes you could see the same shame. A deep, gut-wrenching shame. We were part of this machine. Our sacrifices, the friends we'd buried, it was all being stained by this. That's when the unspoken agreement really solidified among us regulars. If capture ever looked likely, we would do anything at all, to make sure we weren't taken alongside them. The Ivans wouldn't see a difference, and we knew what our fate would be if they associated us with the actions of the SS. But war is a messed-up thing. It twists everything. There were moments, fleeting and fragile, where the divide seemed to vanish, not out of respect, but out of sheer, raw necessity. I remember one night, a Russian artillery barrage started up, the kind that feels like the world is ending. The sky was just constant flashes of light. and the ground shook so hard you thought your teeth would rattled out of your head. The noise was unbearable, a deafening roar that swallowed everything. I was huddled in a muddy hole, not even a proper foxhole, just a depression in the earth, pressing my helmet into the dirt, praying to a God I wasn't sure was listening anymore. Next to me, crammed in the same sliver of mud, was a young SS soldier, couldn't have been more than 18. His face, usually set in that blank, arrogant mask, was pure, unadulterated terror. He was shaking uncontrollably. For a moment we weren't Wehrmacht and SS. We were just two kids, buried in mud, waiting to be blown to pieces. The barrage lifted for a brief second, the kind of eerie quiet that's almost worse than the noise. He fumbled in his tunic with trembling hands, pulled out a cigarette case, a fancy silver thinger, and offered me one. He didn't say a word. I just nodded, and he lit it with a match, his hand cupping the flame, both of our hands shaking so bad we could barely get it done. We smoked in silence, the glow of the cigarettes the only light between us. It tasted like heaven. For 2 minutes, maybe 3, we were just human. Then the barrage started again, and the moment was gone. The mask slipped back onto his face, and he looked away. But I never forgot that. It was the one crack in the wall, a reminder that underneath it all, there was a scared boy just like me. And you have to understand, as much as we despised them, we relied on them in a fight. When the Soviet hordes came at us, wave after wave, their sheer fighting skill was something to behold. They were fearless, almost to a fault. In a desperate defense, when our lines were about to break, and it was just a handful of us left, you'd see them stand and fight with a ferocity that was terrifying, and I have to admit, awe-inspiring. They had better weapons, more ammunition, and a fanatical belief that made them hold ground long after any sane soldier would have retreated. In those moments, when the bullets were flying and death was inches away, the resentment faded into a kind of grim gratitude. You were glad they were on your side, even as you hated the reasons why they fought so hard. It was a complicated, ugly feeling. You'd see them do things in combat that were brutal, efficiency that went beyond soldiering. But when your back is against the wall, you don't question the devil helping you push. You just push. Then, when the attack was over and the adrenaline faded, the unease would return, thicker than before. The relief we felt when they were finally transferred away from our position was palpable, but it was a tainted relief. It was the feeling of a pressure being lifted, but also the knowledge that they were moving on to another part of the front, to do the same things to another bunch of poor Lancer like us, to burn another village and drag another unit's name through the mud. You see, the war wasn't just the enemy across the field. It was the fight next to you, the silent war of living alongside men you feared almost as much as the ones trying to kill you. It was the constant calculation, the weighing of survival against your own soul. And that was a battle we fought every single day, long after the guns had gone quiet. You want to know what it was really like over there. Not the newsreels, not the parades. You want to know about the SS, the ones in the black uniforms who thought they owned the war. Pull up a chair. This isn't something you shout in a beer hall. This is something you say quiet, like in a foxhole after dark, when the only light is from the glow of a cigarette cupped in your hand. We called them a lot of things, my buddies and me, names I won't repeat here. But mostly we just called them a damn waste. See, by the time we'd been in it for a few years, in Russia, in Africa, everywhere they sent us, the war wasn't about flags or politics anymore. It was a trade, a grubby, brutal trade. You learned the price of things. A bullet was worth more than the paper money in your pocket. A dry pair of socks could save your life from trench foot. A can of beef stew, shared between 3 men, was a feast. We were accountants of survival, me and the other fellows in my squad. Men like Schneider from Hamburg, who could fix a jammed MG42 with a piece of wire and a curse, and little Klaus, who was 18 but looked 14, whose hands still shook the first time he had to throw a potato masher grenade. They were my family. The only family that mattered, because their breath fogging in the air next to yours was the only thing that felt real. We moved like ghosts. We dug like moles. A good position wasn't one with a great field of fire. It was one you couldn't be seen from. A smart soldier wasn't the one who stood up and charged. He was the one who lived to see his mother again. We learned the hard way what scarcity meant. I remember once, outside a burned-out village in the Ukraine, we found a single, scrawny chicken. We didn't shoot it. That would have brought every Russian partisan for miles. We cornered it quietly, and that night we boiled it with some stolen potatoes into a thin soup. Every man got a taste, even the sentry we rotated in. That chicken was more valuable than a medal. That's the war we knew. Then you'd see them. The SS. It was like watching a different species fight a different war. I first saw it clear outside a place I don't even remember the name of, some muddy crossroads that meant nothing. We'd been probing the Russian line for a day, using the gullies and the shattered birch trees for cover. We figured we could work around their flank come nightfall, hit their supply line, maybe force them to pull back without a big fight. It was smart. It was how you stayed alive. Then the SS battalion rolled up in their fresh trucks, their uniforms still dark and clean. You could smell the leather of their gear. They looked well-fed. Their officer, a young kid with a face like a choir boy and eyes like ice, strode over to our Oberleutnant. We watched from where we were brewing our ersatz coffee, the kind that tasted like burnt grain. We heard the sneer in his voice. "We will take the position," he said. "A frontal assault, for the glory of the fatherland." Our lieutenant, a man who had frostbite on 2 toes and a deep weariness in his soul, just shook his head. "It's a suicide run. The Russians have that road zeroed in with mortars and a heavy machine gun in the farmhouse. Let us flank them." The SS officer smiled, a thin, bloodless smile. "We do not flank, we break them." And that's what they did. No subtlety, no craft, just a whistle, and they went up that road, shouting, not even using the ditches for cover. It was like a parade ground exercise. And the Russians, well, they were waiting. The machine gun opened up, that rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a heavy Maxim, and I saw men in those black uniforms just disintegrate. A mortar round landed square in the middle of them, and the sound wasn't just an explosion. It was a wet, terrible sound, mixed with the screams. They kept coming, wave after wave, until the road was a carpet of black and fieldgris, churned into the mud. They took the position, eventually. There were enough of them left to overwhelm the few Russians in the farmhouse. But what a price! We had to move up through the carnage afterwards. The smell, God, the smell of blood and opened intestines is something you never forget. It's a sweet, coppery stench that gets in your clothes, in your hair. I saw an SS man, couldn't have been more than 20, lying with his guts spilled out on the road, his hand still clutching a flagpole with a torn black and silver banner. He'd died for a symbol. My buddies and I, we exchanged a look. No words were needed. It was a mixture of pity and pure, unadulterated contempt. We would have taken that position with maybe 2, 3 casualties if we'd done it our way. They lost 50 men for a patch of mud. That was their luxury. A luxury of fanaticism we couldn't afford. We had to count every bullet. They burned through ammunition like it was confetti, firing from the hip on full automatic, wasting rounds on shadows. We'd scavenge their positions afterwards and find crates of ammo they'd left behind because it was too heavy to carry in their glorious charge. We'd take it. We needed it. They thought our carefulness was cowardice. I remember digging a foxhole one evening, a deep one, because you learn quick that a shallow hole is a grave. An SS trooper walked by and laughed. "Digging your grave, old man," he sneered. I was 25. I looked up at him, the mud caked on my hands. "No, son," I said. "I'm digging my home for the night. You should try it. It's warmer than a coffin." He just shook his head and walked off. They didn't understand that retreating wasn't running away. It was living to kill the enemy tomorrow, on your terms. They thought honor was in dying for the Führer. We thought honor was in making sure the kid next to you, the one who showed you the photo of his girl back in Köln, lived to see her again. But the worst of it, the thing that sat in your gut like a cold stone, was knowing that their crimes were becoming our burden. We heard the stories, whispers at first, then louder. The massacres, the villages. We'd see the smoke on the horizon and know it wasn't just a battle. We were soldiers. We fought other soldiers. It was dirty and terrible, but there was a code, or at least we tried to hold on to one. What they were doing, it was something else. And we knew, with a certainty that froze your blood, that the Russians, the Americans, they wouldn't make a distinction. To them, a German uniform was a German uniform. The retribution for what the SS was doing would fall on all of us. Their fanaticism was a debt, and we were the ones who would have to pay it with our blood. I remember capturing a Russian lieutenant during a patrol. He was wounded, scared. My instinct, the one the army drilled into you, was to treat him according to the rules. We gave him a sip of water from our canteen, used a field dressing on his leg. He kept looking at us, waiting for the bullet. When he realized it wasn't coming, the relief in his eyes, it was like a tiny piece of your own humanity coming back to you. It was a small thing, but we did those things deliberately, sharing a cigarette with a prisoner, letting a farmer keep his last pig. It was a way of reminding yourself, I am not them. I am still a man. That became more important than any victory. The only people you could talk to about it were the other veterans, the ones who'd been there since the beginning. You'd be sharing a cigarette during a lull in the shelling, and you just nod towards where the SS were billeted. A shared look of disgust was all that was needed. A raised eyebrow, a slow shake of the head. That was the whole conversation. Words were too dangerous, but in that silence, you understood everything. You understood the shared fear that these maniacs were going to get us all killed for an idea, while we were just fighting for the man shivering in the hole next to us. That was the real split, you see. They were fighting for an abstraction, for a 1,000-year Reich that was crumbling into the mud around us. We were fighting for Schneider and Klaus and the hope of one more sunrise, one more letter from home. In the end, that's all that was left. The hope that if you made it through, if you somehow cheated the statistics and the shells and the cold, you could tell a story. Not a story of glory, but a story of difference. A story that said, we were not all the same. Some of us were just soldiers, trying to survive the hell that other men created. And that's the story I'm telling you now. It's the only victory I have left. You learn real fast in this war to shut things out, to build a wall inside your head just to keep from going crazy. For me, that wall was the medic's oath. It was my rock. In the middle of all that screaming chaos, when the world was just smoke and mud and the wrath-throated shriek of shells, I'd repeat it to myself like a prayer. No face, no uniform, just a life. Just stop the bleeding. Just ease the pain. It had to be that simple, you see, because if it wasn't, you'd break. In the beginning, it was almost easy in a terrible, cold way. A wound was a wound. A tourniquet was a tourniquet. It didn't matter if the flesh was pale from a farm in Bavaria or tanned from some alpine village. Blood was always the same shocking red, and it smelled the same, that thick, coppery smell that gets in the back of your throat and stays there for days. You work with a kind of frantic efficiency, your hands moving on their own, your mind a blank slate except for the steps. Find the source, apply pressure, sulfur powder, bandage, morphia if you had it, move on. You couldn't let your eyes focus on the face, really see who it was. You'd see the grey-green of the Feldgrau, but you trained yourself not to look at the collar tabs, not to register the insignia on the sleeve. It was just a soldier, a body broken by the same steel that didn't care about politics or race or any of the nonsense they preached back in Berlin. Out there in the dirt, we were all just men, and the great equalizer was a piece of shrapnel. But walls crack. They always do. The first time it really hit me, I was in a ruined barn somewhere in the Ukraine, the air thick with the smell of hay and blood and cordite. We had a hell of a pounding from the Russian artillery, a real Trommelfeuer, and the casualties were coming in fast. I was kneeling next to a kid, couldn't have been more than 18, his leg a mess. I was talking to him, the usual soothing nonsense. You'll be all right, son, hang on, we'll get you fixed up. My hands busy with the shears to cut away his trouser leg. And that's when I saw it. On the pale, soft skin of his inner arm, just below the bicep, were the blood group tattoo. And right above it, the twin lightning bolts, the SS runes. I froze for a second, my hands stopping their work. This boy, with a face still round with youth, soft, blonde fuzz on his cheeks, was one of them. My mind flashed to things I'd seen, things I tried to bury. A village square, bodies piled like cordwood, the cold, arrogant stares of the SS political officers. And here was one of their own, bleeding into the Ukrainian soil, his eyes wide with a child's fear. He wasn't a monster in that moment. He was just a scared kid calling for his mother. Screams, the high-pitched, guttural cries of pain, they were exactly the same as the boys from my own company, the same as my friend Klaus from the village back home. That's when the war started inside me, a war that had nothing to do with Russians or Germans, but a war between my duty and my soul. That internal conflict became my constant companion. There were moments that tested everything I thought I knew about myself, like the time we had to prioritize treatment after a particularly nasty ambush. We were overwhelmed, just a handful of medics, and we had to make the cold, calculating decisions that still haunt me. The walking wounded over there, the critical cases here, and I saw two men side by side. One was a sergeant from my own unit, a good man named Weber who always shared his black bread, his stomach torn open. Next to him was an SS officer, unconscious, a nasty head wound but likely survivable. The training, the triage protocol, was clear in a clinical sense. But in my heart, a dark, guilty wave of relief washed over me when I knew I had to go to Weber first. I had to attend to my comrade. And as I worked on Weber, trying to keep his insides from spilling out, I was acutely, shamefully aware of the SS man breathing raggedly a few feet away. Part of me hoped he would just stop breathing before I got to him. That's the truth of it. And that thought, that wishing for a man's death, felt like a stain on something I held sacred. Then there was the hollow feeling, the emptiness that would follow after you'd actually saved one of them. You depatch them up, stop the bleeding, get them stabilized for evacuation, and a profound weariness would set in that was more than just physical exhaustion. It was a spiritual drain. I'd look at my hands, covered in his blood, and I'd wonder, what have I done? Did I just put this weapon back on the field? Will the strength I just gave him be used to murder more civilians, to execute more prisoners? You'd see the arrogance return to their eyes as the shock wore off, that sense of superiority, even as they lay broken and helpless. It made you feel like a traitor to your own humanity. But the most confusing moment of all, I remember a young one, younger than the rest, his uniform swamping his thin frame. He had a chest wound, a bad one. The bubbling sound when he breathed told me it was a lung. There was nothing much to be done, just morphia to ease the passage. I held his head, gave him a sip of water from my canteen. His eyes, a clear, startling blue, were wide with fear, but they focused on me. He was fading fast, and he grabbed my sleeve with a weak hand. He didn't see a medic or an enemy or even a man. He just saw a human presence in his final moments, and he whispered it, just one word with his last breath. Comrade, comrade. And then he was gone. That word. It shattered me. In his dying moment, he claimed a kinship with me, a bond forged in shared suffering on this God-forsaken patch of earth. And for a terrible second, I felt it too. Not for the SS, not for what he represented, but for the sheer, lonely terror of dying so far from home. The confusion was a physical ache. How could I feel pity, even a shred of compassion, for one of them? It felt like a betrayal of every atrocity I knew they'd committed. In that barn, or that ditch, or that frozen field, the politics fell away, and you were left with the raw, ugly truth of mortality. It was just one boy, and another boy, and a universe of pain between them. After a long night of that, of moving from broken body to broken body, your own uniform stiff with other men's blood, you'd finally stagger back to what was left of your own unit. The silence that greeted you was different from the usual exhausted quiet. It was a heavy, knowing silence. The other veterans, the guys who'd been through it, they'd just look at you. They wouldn't ask. There was no need. You'd see it in their eyes, a grim understanding. They knew the weight you were carrying. They'd nod, maybe hand you a cigarette, their own hands trembling slightly. That was all. No words. What could you say? That you just spent hours saving the lives of men who, in any other circumstance, you would have gladly seen dead. That the very creed that kept you sane was also tearing you apart. They knew. We were all carrying burdens that didn't show up on any service record. And you carried that weight long after the guns fell silent, long after the last surrender was signed. You carry it still. It's not the big things people ask about, the battles or the famous names. It's the small, intimate details that cling to you like ghosts. The feel of a cold, clammy forehead under your palm. The particular sound of a man trying to scream with a punctured lung. The way the light faded from a pair of eyes, whether they were brown or blue, whether they belonged to a friend or a foe. The weight of a dog tag you'd have to cut from a neck, still warm. The taste of cheap schnapps that never quite washed the taste of blood and dust out of your mouth. The dark, grim humor we used as a shield, joking about things that weren't funny, because if you didn't laugh, you'd cry, and if you started crying, you might never stop. The homesickness that was a physical pain, a longing for the smell of your mother's kitchen, the sound of church bells on a Sunday morning, anything that was clean and whole and untouched by the madness. War, from the inside of a helmet, isn't about grand strategy or flags on a map. It's about the cold that seeps into your bones in a Russian winter, the kind of cold that makes you forget what it felt like to be warm. It's about the gnawing hunger in your belly when the supply lines are cut, and the shared joy of finding a can of mystery meat. It's about the terror that turns your bowels to water when the shells start falling, and the fierce, desperate love you feel for the man in the foxhole next to you. The unspoken vow that you'll look out for each other because no one else will. It's about trying to hold on to a shred of your own humanity when everything around you is dedicated to its destruction. And for me, it was about the ultimate test of that humanity, to offer compassion without judgment, to heal without prejudice, even when every fiber of your being screamed in revolt. I saved lives that day, all kinds of lives, and I have to live with that, all of it. The faces, the voices, the gratitude, the contempt, they all fade into one long, silent scream that echoes in your dreams forever. You just learn to live with the noise. You want to know how it really was. Not the parades you see in the old newsreels, not the speeches. You want to know what it felt like in the mud and the snow, with the smell of cordite and fear thick in the air. I'll tell you. But it starts before the mud. It starts with a clean uniform and a head full of nonsense. They shipped us east in the dead of winter, a whole train car of us replacements, green as grass and shivering despite the thick wool of our greatcoats. The steam from the locomotive mixed with our breath, and we told each other stories, the kind of stories boys tell who have never heard a shot fired in anger. We talked of knights' crosses and iron crosses, of heroic charges and the undying camaraderie of the Frenchwing, the old pigs who'd been in the thick of it since Poland. We were convinced we were joining a band of brothers, a unified force where every man was a patriot, a hero. That's the lie they feed you with your marching rations, the patriotic fervor that tastes so sweet when you're 1,000 kilometers from the screaming shells. I remember the clatter of the wheels on the tracks, a sound that promised adventure, and the way the frost etched intricate patterns on the grimy window, patterns I'd trace with a numb finger, imagining my mother's face in the ice. We were scared, sure. Any man who says he wasn't is a liar, but it was a clean fear, the kind you feel before a football match, all nerves and excitement. We had no idea. No idea that the real fear, the kind that sinks into your bones and makes a home there, wasn't waiting for us from the Russians, but from men who wore the same uniform, who supposedly fought for the same cause. The first reality check came the moment we stumbled off that train, our legs stiff and our backs aching, into a sea of churned-up mud and slush that was the divisional reserve area. The veterans who were supposed to integrate us, they didn't look like heroes. They looked like ghosts, their faces grey and hollowed out, their eyes old, so much older than their years. They moved with a slow, deliberate economy, conserving every ounce of energy. There was no fanaticism in their eyes, no fire, just a deep, bottomless exhaustion. They sorted through us new meat with a kind of weary disdain, grabbing a few items from our packs, a spare pair of socks, some decent tobacco, a grunt that was neither a thank you nor a request. They spoke in short, clipped sentences, a language of survival. And then one of them, an Oberjefreiter with a scar running from his eyebrow to his jaw, caught me staring at a group of men in sharp, black-bordered collar patches moving through the camp with a swagger we didn't possess. He pulled me aside, his grip like iron on my arm, and his breath smelled of cheap schnapps and rotten teeth. He got right in my face, his voice a low growl that barely carried over the wind. "You see them," he hissed, nodding toward the black uniforms. "The Totenkopf, the Death's Head boys. You keep your eyes down and your mouth shut when they're around. Understand? You don't look at them, you don't talk to them. They're not like us." He said us with a weight that defined my entire world from that moment on. There was us, the Wehrmacht, the regular army grunts, and there was them. And the atmosphere when an SS patrol passed through our camp was like a sudden temperature drop. The easy laughter died, shoulders tensed, men found sudden urgent business elsewhere. It was a palpable thing, a chill that had nothing to do with the Russian winter. That chill became an ice block in my gut a week later, during my first real taste of the front near a godforsaken village whose name I've spent 50 years trying to forget. The Russians hit us with a bombardment that felt like the end of the world, the earth itself convulsing, throwing dirt and snow and men into the air. The noise wasn't just sound. It was a physical force that punched the air from your lungs and rattled your teeth in your skull. We were raw, we were terrified, and our line broke. It wasn't an orderly retreat. It was a rout, a blind animal panic. We fell back through a wooded area, stumbling over tree roots and frozen corpses, the screams of the wounded chasing us. I ended up in a ragged group with a few other replacements and some veterans, including that same Obergefreiter from the camp. We were trying to regroup, our breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps, when we ran straight into them. An SS patrol, led by a Hauptsturmführer who looked like he'd just stepped out of a tailoring shop, his uniform immaculate, his face a mask of cold contempt. He blocked our path, his men fanning out behind him, their machine pistols held at the ready, but not pointed at the Russians pointed at us. One of our boys, a kid named Klaus who couldn't have been more than 17, was weeping openly, shaking uncontrollably, babbling about the shells, about his friend who'd been blown to pieces right next to him. The SS officer walked up to him, calm as you please, and slapped him hard across the face. "Compose yourself, soldier," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. But Klaus was lost to his terror. He just kept sobbing, sinking to his knees. The officer looked at him for a long moment, and then he looked at us, a sweep of his eyes that seemed to measure each of us for a coffin. He said something about cowardice in the face of the enemy, about poisoning the fighting spirit, about the necessity of an example. He drew his Luger. I remember the click of the safety being released, a sound sharper than any shell burst in that moment. The Obergefreiter next to me started to say, "Herr Hauptsturmführer, he's just a boy." But the officer didn't even glance his way. He put the pistol to the back of Klaus's head and fired. The sound was oddly muffled. Klaus just folded forward into the snow. There was no drama, no last words, just a sudden, shocking silence, broken only by the distant thump of artillery. The officer holstered his weapon, wiped a speck of blood from his glove, and said, "The rest of you, back to the line. The fatherland expects you to die, not to run." They were gone, melting back into the trees as if they were never there. We stood there, frozen, staring at the dark red stain spreading around Klaus's head, a stark contrast against the pure white snow. That was the moment my world shattered. The enemy wasn't just across the field. The enemy wore a black uniform and spoke your own language. That was the lesson, my chilling education, delivered in a single, brutal moment. From then on, you learned to keep your head down and your mouth shut around them. You developed a sixth sense for their presence, a tightening in your gut that warned you before you even saw them. Your survival depended on it. But out of that betrayal, out of that shared, unspoken terror, something else was forged. It bonded our unit together more tightly than any enemy shelling ever could. The brotherhood we found wasn't in the shouted slogans or the political fanaticism. It was in the quiet defiance of the veterans. It was in the way the Obergefreiter, whose name was Erich, would later slip me an extra piece of black bread, a silent acknowledgement of what we'd witnessed. It was in the dark, gallows humor that got us through the days. You haven't lived until you've heard a man joke about which part of his body he'd rather lose to frostbite, all while rubbing his feet to keep the circulation going. It was in the way we'd huddle in a foxhole, 2 or 3 men sharing body heat, not saying a word, just listening to the wind howl across the steppe, each man lost in his own thoughts of home. You talk about stupid things, the taste of your mother's apple cake, the girl you kissed before you left, the feel of a dry pair of socks. These were the things that kept you human. The SS had their ideology. We had each other. Our patriotism was stripped away, replaced by a simpler, more primal loyalty to the man next to you in the trench. He's the one who shares his last cigarette, who wakes you for your watch, who drags you back to the aid station when you catch a piece of shrapnel. That was the real comradeship, forged not in glory, but in the shared understanding of the absurd, terrifying reality we inhabited. We were just boys who wanted to survive, to go home. The loss of that innocence, the death of the eager replacement I'd been on the train, was a terrible price to pay. But what grew in its place, that survival instinct, that bond with the men who truly understood, that was the only thing that felt real. That was the war I knew, not the one in the history books. It was a war fought in the heart, as much as on the battlefield, a constant, quiet war against the darkness, both outside and within. You never forget the cold, not that kind of cold. It was a different animal altogether, a living thing that crawled right through your greatcoat and your wool layers, right down to the bone, and it set up shop there. It was the Russian winter of '43, And it was our real enemy, more than the Ivans across the frozen rubble, more than anything. Your rifle bolt would freeze solid if you didn't work it every few minutes. The breath would ice up on your scarf until it was a stiff mask. And the snow wasn't white anymore, not in Stalingrad. It was this dirty, churned up grey and brown, stained with things you didn't want to think about. We were a mixed bag of here regulars, what was left of us, pulled back to a shattered neighborhood that was just skeletons of buildings, and we were sharing this hell with a bunch of SS men from the Wicking Division. Normally, you kept your distance. They kept theirs. They had that look, you know, that dead-eyed certainty, the black uniforms that seemed to soak up the little light there was. To us grunts, they were like creatures from another world, fanatics who'd as soon report you for defeatism as look at you. But in that cold, in that constant hammering of the Russian artillery, all the lines started to blur. Your uniform, whether it was Feldgrau or black, it didn't matter a damn when a shell had your name on it. We got caught in a real bad spot. My little group me, Klaus, and the old man, Unteroffizier Bauer, a tough old bird from the First War. The Ivans were pushing hard, and the only cover was this cellar of a bombed-out apartment block. We scrambled down the frozen steps, slipping on ice and broken brick, and plunged into the darkness. And that's when we found we weren't alone. There were already figures down there, huddled in the gloom. The second my eyes adjusted, I saw the silver skulls on their collars. SS, 4 of them. It was like walking into a cage with wolves. The air went thick, heavier than the dust and cordite we brought in with us. We just stood there, us on one side of this dank cellar, them on the other, in a silence that was louder than the shelling outside. You could hear the drip-drip of meltwater somewhere, and the ragged breathing of men trying not to make a sound. Bauer, he just gave a curt nod to their ranking guy, a young Sturmführer who looked like he hadn't slept in a week, and that was that. The standoff was set. We were trapped together. For the first hour, nothing. Just the thump and crump of the outside world coming apart. You'd flinch with every close one, the whole cellar would shake, and plaster would dust down on your helmet. I kept my eyes on them, and I could feel their eyes on us. It was a different kind of fear, mixed with a deep, weary contempt. We were just trying to survive, to see home again. They were fighting for some grand, bloody idea, and they'd get us all killed for it. Klaus, who was always nervous, was fumbling with his canteen. He finally got it open and took a shaky drink. Then he did something that broke the spell. He looked across the space, at the youngest-looking SS kid, who was staring at that canteen like it was the last water on Earth. Klaus, without a word, just held it out. The kid glanced at his Sturmführer, who gave a barely perceptible shrug, and then he scrambled over, took the canteen, and drank greedily. He handed it back with a quiet, dank. It was just a word, but in that place, it was like a crack in a dam. That simple act, a shared need, started to thaw the ice. Bauer pulled out a crumpled pack of cigarettes, the paper gone soft with damp. He offered one to the Sturmführer. The guy hesitated, then took it, and Bauer struck a match, the flame illuminating their tired, grimy faces for a second. The light caught the Sturmführer's eyes, and there was no fanaticism there, just the same hollowed-out exhaustion I saw in the mirror when I dared to look. We all started shifting, moving a little closer, not as two groups anymore, but just as men in a whole. The shelling settled into a steady, ominous rhythm, letting us know they were getting ready for the real push. One of the SS men, a big fellow with a bandage around his head, started talking. Not about politics, not about the Führer. He talked about his home in Bavaria, the mountains, the smell of his mother's apple strudel. His voice was low, stripped of all its usual SS arrogance. It was just a voice, cracked with fear and longing. And then another guy, one of ours, chimed in about his family's farm in Schleswig, the way the North Sea wind smelled. It was like we were all conjuring ghosts of a world that didn't exist anymore, just to keep from going mad right there. Then, through the bombardment, I heard it, a soft humming. It was the big SS man with the bandage. He was humming this old folk song, Die Gedanken sind frei, thoughts are free. My Oma used to sing that, my throat tightened. Without even thinking, I started to hum along softly. Then Klaus joined in. Then one of the other SS men. And then in the near darkness, with the world exploding above us, we were all singing it. Quietly at first, then a little stronger. Our voices, rough and unused, blending together in the dark. It wasn't a Nazi song, it wasn't a marching song, it was just a human song. a song about a thing they were trying to take away from us. For those few minutes, the war outside vanished. There were no regulars, no SS, no Russians. There were just a bunch of scared boys, far from home, finding a sliver of comfort in a shared melody. It was the most heartbreaking sound I've ever heard. That song changed everything. The rest of the night, we were just men. We shared what little we had. A piece of hardtack, a sip of schnapps from a flask one of the SS guys produced. We talked in whispers, not as soldiers, but as survivors. Bauer and the Sturmführer even had a low, grim conversation about the tactical situation, their heads closed together. They weren't an Unteroffizier and a Sturmführer anymore. They were just the two oldest guys in the room trying to figure out how to get the rest of us through the night. And we made an agreement. It wasn't spoken, not out loud. It was made with glances, with nods. We all knew the assault was coming at first light. We were low on everything Gammo, grenades, hope. The agreement was that if the Ivans came down those steps, we would fight as one. We would share the last magazine, the last potato masher. We would die together in that cellar, not as Heer and SS, but as men who had shared a water bottle and a song. And the other part of the agreement, the unspoken part that hung heavier than the first, was that at dawn, if we were still alive, the truce was over. We would go back to our separate sides, back to being what the war had made us. Dawn came not with sunlight, but with a pale, grey creep of light through the rubble at the top of the cellar steps. The shelling had stopped, replaced by an eerie, ringing silence that was almost worse. It was time. We stirred, our bodies stiff and aching from the cold and the hard ground. We checked our weapons, avoiding each other's eyes now. The moment had passed. The SS men gathered their gear, their faces hardening back into the masks they needed to wear. As we filed out, single file, back into the ruined world, I was last in our group. The young SS kid, the one who'd taken the water from Klaus, was ahead of me. He paused at the threshold, looked back, and our eyes met. He didn't smile. There was no warmth left, but he gave me a single, slow nod. It wasn't a friendly gesture. It was a recognition of the shared suffering, of the cold, of the fear, of the strange, fleeting kinship we'd found in the dark. It was an acknowledgement that for a few hours we had remembered how to be human. Then he turned and was gone, his black uniform disappearing into the ruins, and we went our separate ways. We never spoke of it again, not even amongst ourselves. It was a secret we all carried, a pocket of stillness in the madness. That's the memory that haunts me, even now, all these years later. Not the big battles, not the medals, but that night in the cellar. How do you reconcile that? How do you fit the image of that big SS man, crying softly as he talked about his mother's apple strudel, with the stories we heard later, the things those same men were capable of, the brutality, the ideology that poisoned everything? The man in the cellar was a man. The soldier in the black uniform was a monster, but they were the same person. That's the impossible truth I've carried my whole life. That strange, painful memory of a truce in the ruins, a moment of grace carved out of hell, is the one I've never told anyone until now. It was too fragile, too human, to be touched by the explanations and the histories. It was ours. A secret between enemies, a memory of a time when the cold was the only thing that mattered, and a simple song was enough to save us, just for one night.